A monarch whose body was literally falling apart while he was still alive, oozing pus and rotting flesh that could be smelled from rooms away. A man who turned marriage into a death sentence and made the Tower of London England's most terrifying address. Welcome to the real story of Henry VIII, and trust me, what you're about to discover will make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. Most people think they know Henry VIII as the jolly, larger-than-life king who couldn't keep a wife, but the actual truth is so much more horrifying, so completely twisted, that historians have spent centuries trying to soften the edges of this monster's legacy. We're talking about a ruler whose paranoia was so extreme he slept with loaded weapons, whose eating habits would make competitive eaters quit in disgust, and whose treatment of women went far beyond simple execution into realms of psychological torture that would impress modern serial killers. Before we dive into this absolute horror show, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'm genuinely fascinated to know we're all connected across the globe. Now prepare yourself, because once you learn what Henry VIII was really like, you'll never be able to think about the Tudor period or royal power the same way again. Let's start with the most stomach-churning truth about Henry VIII. By the final decade of his life, he had become a living, breathing horror movie. We're not talking about someone who was just overweight or unhealthy. This man's body had transformed into something so grotesque that even medieval people who were used to disease and filth were physically sickened by his presence. Henry's transformation from the athletic young prince into this walking nightmare began around 1536, when he suffered a catastrophic jousting accident that changed everything. During a tournament at Greenwich Palace, Henry was knocked unconscious for over 2 hours. In an era when medical understanding was primitive, this essentially meant he was clinically dead. When he finally regained consciousness, those close to him noticed immediate personality changes. The relatively reasonable young king became increasingly paranoid, violent, and completely unpredictable. But the physical changes were even more horrifying. The jousting accident left Henry with leg wounds that never properly healed, and over the years these wounds became festering, rotting ulcers that consumed more and more of his lower body. We're not talking about small cuts here. These were massive open sores that constantly oozed pus, blood, and decomposing flesh. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers would literally gag when approaching the king. Contemporary accounts describe the stench as being detectable from several rooms away. Servants would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when forced to attend to Henry, and many would actually vomit from the smell alone. The king's own physicians were so disgusted by the condition of his legs that they would make excuses to avoid examining him, despite the fact that refusing to treat the king could be considered treason. As Henry aged, his weight ballooned to astronomical proportions. By his final years, he weighed approximately 400 pounds, with a waist that measured an incredible 54 inches. To put this in perspective, that's larger than most people are tall. His face became so swollen with fat that his eyes were barely visible as tiny slits in his massive head. His neck disappeared entirely, creating the appearance of a giant balloon sitting on top of his shoulders. The king's mobility became so limited that he required specially constructed chairs with pulleys and wheels to move around his palaces. Teams of servants were assigned to operate these contraptions, essentially carrying the rotting monarch from room to room. But here's the truly revolting part. As they moved him, pieces of infected flesh would literally fall off his legs, leaving a trail of decomposing royal remains throughout the palace corridors. Palace servants were forced to follow behind Henry's mobile chair with cloths and buckets, cleaning up the chunks of rotting king that dropped as he moved. Imagine being a servant whose job description included royal flesh cleanup duty. These people were so traumatized by their work that many quit their positions despite the prestigious nature of serving the king directly. The psychological impact on those around Henry was devastating. Courtiers who had once competed for the honor of being in the king's presence now dreaded any summons to appear before him. The combination of his terrifying appearance, horrific smell, and completely unpredictable violent behavior turned royal court life into a living nightmare for everyone involved. But Henry's physical deterioration was just the beginning of the horror story. The brain injury from his jousting accident had fundamentally altered his personality, transforming him from someone who could at least pretend to be civilized into a monster who seemed to take genuine pleasure in causing suffering. The man who had once written love letters and composed music became someone who would order executions for the smallest perceived slights, and who would force people to watch their loved ones die before killing them as well. Medical experts today believe Henry suffered from a combination of conditions that would have made his final years absolutely excruciating. Along with the obvious obesity and infected leg ulcers, he likely had Cushing's syndrome, which would explain his dramatic weight gain, mood swings, and the wounds that refused to heal. He may have also developed diabetes, which would have made the leg infections even more dangerous and painful. The truly tragic irony is that Henry, who claimed divine right to rule and insisted that God had chosen him to be king, couldn't even control his own bodily functions by the end of his life. Royal attendants had to carry special portable toilets wherever Henry went because he could barely make it from room to room without having accidents. The man who executed people for showing him insufficient respect was literally falling apart in the most undignified ways possible. Everyone knows the rhyme about Henry VIII's wives: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But this simple summary doesn't even begin to capture the absolute psychological torture that these women endured. We're talking about a level of mental cruelty that goes far beyond physical execution. Henry didn't just kill his wives, he systematically destroyed their minds first, turning marriage to the King of England into the most terrifying experience a woman could endure. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife and arguably the one who suffered the longest psychological torment. Catherine wasn't just divorced, she was systematically isolated, humiliated, and driven to what many believe was an eventual poisoning death. When Henry decided he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, he didn't simply ask Catherine for a divorce. Instead, he declared that their 24-year marriage had never been valid in the eyes of God, essentially calling Catherine a whore who had been living in sin for over 2 decades. But the cruelty went much deeper than public humiliation. Henry forbade Catherine from seeing their daughter Mary, using the child as a weapon against her mother. Imagine being told that you can't see your own daughter because your husband has decided your marriage never existed. Catherine spent her final years essentially under house arrest, forbidden from using her royal title, cut off from friends and family, and constantly threatened with execution if she didn't agree to Henry's version of reality. The psychological warfare Henry waged against Catherine was calculated and relentless. He would send her gifts and kind messages one day, then threaten her with treason charges the next. He forced her to sign documents acknowledging that their marriage was invalid, then would change his mind and demand different documents. The constant uncertainty and fear literally drove Catherine to physical illness. She developed severe stomach problems that many historians believe were caused by chronic stress and possible poisoning attempts. When Catherine finally died in 1536, she was completely alone except for a handful of loyal servants. Henry refused to attend her funeral and forbade their daughter Mary from visiting her mother's deathbed. Catherine's final letters to Henry, begging him to show mercy to their daughter and professing her continued love for him, were never answered. The man she had loved and served faithfully for over 2 decades couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge her death. Anne Boleyn's fate was even more horrific because Henry's treatment of her revealed his capacity for elaborate sadistic planning. When Henry decided he wanted to be rid of Anne, he didn't just order her execution, he orchestrated an entire conspiracy designed to maximize her psychological suffering before her death. First, Henry had Anne's musician, Mark Smeaton, tortured until he confessed to having an affair with the Queen. But Henry wasn't satisfied with just one confession. He arrested 4 other men, including Anne's own brother George, and forced them to confess to adultery with Anne as well. The psychological torture of watching innocent people being destroyed because of their association with her must have been unbearable for Anne. But Henry's cruelty reached its peak when he forced Anne to watch the executions of all 5 men who had allegedly slept with her. She had to stand there knowing she would be next, watching her brother and innocent friends die because of her husband's paranoid fantasies. The sight of her brother's severed head being held up for the crowd was designed to break her mentally before her own execution. Even Anne's execution was turned into a psychological torture session. Henry originally scheduled her to be burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for adultery, but then mercifully changed it to beheading. He imported a special executioner from France, supposedly to ensure a clean death, but really to drag out Anne's psychological torment for additional days while she waited for the executioner to arrive. Anne spent her final days in the Tower of London alternating between hysteria and eerie calmness, sometimes laughing uncontrollably and sometimes praying for hours. The psychological pressure of knowing she was about to die for crimes she hadn't committed, combined with the trauma of watching innocent men die because of her, had clearly pushed her to the edge of sanity. Catherine Howard's story is perhaps the most disturbing because she was essentially a teenager when Henry married her, and his treatment of her reveals his capacity for destroying young minds. Catherine was maybe 19 or 20 when Henry, now a grotesquely obese man in his late 40s with rotting legs, decided to make her his 5th wife. The marriage itself was probably traumatic enough. Imagine being a young woman forced to share a bed with a man whose body was literally decomposing. When Henry discovered that Catherine had sexual relationships before their marriage, his reaction revealed the full extent of his psychological cruelty. He didn't just execute Catherine, he passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their complete sexual history. Think about the incredible narcissism and pettiness required to change the entire legal system because you discovered your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. But Henry's treatment of Catherine went beyond legal changes. He had her imprisoned in the Tower of London for months before her execution, during which time he would send her messages alternating between false hope and death threats. One day he would hint that she might be pardoned if she confessed her sins. The next day he would send detailed descriptions of how her execution would be carried out. The psychological torture was so severe that Catherine reportedly had multiple nervous breakdowns while imprisoned. Guards described her as alternating between periods of complete silence and fits of screaming that could be heard throughout the tower. When she was finally executed, witnesses noted that she appeared to have aged years in just the few months of her imprisonment. The stress had literally changed her physical appearance. Jane Seymour, often called the lucky wife because she died of natural causes, actually reveals another aspect of Henry's cruelty. Jane died from complications following the birth of Henry's son Edward, but Henry's reaction to her death shows his complete inability to see his wives as human beings rather than breeding stock. Within days of Jane's death, Henry was already making plans for his next marriage. He waited exactly 9 days after Jane's funeral to start negotiating with potential new wives. But the most revealing detail about Henry's treatment of Jane is what happened during her labor. Jane was in labor for over 30 hours, clearly in extreme distress. But Henry's physicians were more concerned with saving the baby than the mother. There are accounts suggesting that Henry actually gave orders prioritizing the child's life over Jane's, essentially treating his wife as a disposable vessel for producing an heir. Anne of Cleves might seem like another lucky wife because she survived, but her experience reveals Henry's capacity for psychological manipulation on a massive scale. When Henry decided he didn't want to be married to Anne, he forced her to agree to an annulment by threatening her with execution if she refused. Anne was so terrified of Henry that she agreed to pretend their marriage had never happened and actually thanked him for the privilege of not being murdered. The psychological pressure Henry put on Anne was incredible. He essentially gave her the choice between agreeing to public humiliation or facing the same fate as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Anne chose survival, but the price was having to spend the rest of her life pretending that her marriage to the King of England had been a mistake that never really counted. Catherine Parr, the final wife who survived, actually came closer to execution than most people realize. Henry had actually signed the warrant for her arrest on charges of heresy, but Catherine managed to save herself through an act of psychological manipulation that reveals just how terrifying it was to be married to Henry VIII. When Catherine learned about the arrest warrant, she went to Henry and convinced him that her religious discussions weren't attempts to teach him, but rather attempts to learn from his superior wisdom. This act of complete submission and ego-stroking was enough to save Catherine's life, but imagine the psychological strain of having to constantly monitor every word you spoke to your own husband, knowing that the wrong phrase could literally get you executed. Catherine lived in constant fear that Henry would change his mind about her, and she spent her entire marriage walking on eggshells around a man whose mood swings could be deadly. The most disturbing aspect of Henry's treatment of his wives is that none of them had any real options for escape. Divorce wasn't available to them. Running away would be considered treason, and fighting back would guarantee not just their own execution but potentially the destruction of their entire families. These women were trapped in marriages with a man who grew more physically disgusting and psychologically dangerous with each passing year, with no hope of freedom except through death. If you think modern competitive eating is extreme, wait until you hear about Henry VIII's daily food consumption. This man didn't just eat like a king, he ate like he was personally trying to consume the entire agricultural output of England. We're talking about eating habits so excessive, so completely insane, that they would be considered mental illness by today's standards. Henry consumed approximately 5,000 calories per day during his later years. That's more than double what an active adult male should eat. And remember, this guy could barely walk by the end of his life. But the sheer quantity wasn't even the most disturbing part of his eating habits. It was the ritualistic, almost religious way he approached food, combined with paranoid security measures that turned every meal into a bizarre theatrical performance. A typical dinner for Henry VIII included an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several different types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to intoxicate a dozen men. His kitchen staff prepared over 800 different dishes every single day just for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. The royal kitchens employed over 200 people working around the clock to keep up with his appetite, more staff than many modern restaurants employ today. But here's where Henry's eating habits crossed the line from gluttony into genuine mental illness. He believed that different foods had magical properties that could change his physical and mental abilities. Henry was convinced that eating swan would make him more graceful in movement, despite the fact that by this point he needed mechanical assistance just to stand up. He believed that consuming large amounts of deer meat would make him a better hunter, even though he was too obese to ride a horse or draw a bow. Most disturbing of all, Henry believed that oysters would enhance his sexual performance with his wives, so he would gorge himself on massive quantities of oysters before visiting his wife's chambers, apparently unaware that his grotesque physical appearance and horrific body odor were probably bigger obstacles to romance than any dietary deficiency. The rituals surrounding Henry's meals were absolutely insane. Every single piece of food that entered the king's mouth was first tasted by multiple servants to check for poison, but Henry's paranoia went far beyond normal security precautions. He required his food tasters to wait 30 minutes after eating before he would touch anything, just to make sure they didn't drop dead from delayed-acting poison. But even that wasn't enough for Henry's paranoid mind. He also required that his meals be prepared in completely sealed kitchens with guards watching every step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water had to be tested by different people. A simple meal became a military operation involving dozens of people and hours of preparation. Henry's dining experiences were basically theatrical performances where he ate in front of hundreds of courtiers, and the whole process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there watching this massive rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior. Courtiers were required to watch and appear interested and impressed by Henry's appetite, even as the smell from his rotting legs made many of them nauseous. The psychological impact of these meal performances on the court was devastating. People were forced to smile and applaud while watching their king consume obscene amounts of food, knowing that showing any sign of disgust or disapproval could be interpreted as criticism of royal behavior, which was treason. The dinners became exercises in collective psychological torture where everyone had to pretend they weren't witnessing something deeply disturbing. Henry's food paranoia reached absolutely ridiculous levels when he banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he considered them beneath his royal status. Common people's food like turnips, barley, and peas were literally illegal at the royal table, even though they probably would have been much better for his health than the mountains of meat and sugar he consumed daily. The irony is staggering. While Henry was gorging himself on enough food to feed dozens of people, much of England was dealing with food shortages and agricultural problems. The king's excessive consumption wasn't just personally destructive, it was literally taking food away from his subjects. The royal kitchens consumed enormous quantities of meat, grain, and other staples that could have fed hundreds of common families. Even more disturbing is how Henry's eating habits affected his decision-making as a ruler. Contemporary accounts describe him making important political and military decisions while in the middle of massive eating binges, often while so intoxicated from wine that he could barely speak coherently. Treaties were signed, wars were declared, and people were sentenced to death by a king who was often too drunk and food drunk to understand what he was agreeing to. The most grotesque aspect of Henry's gluttony was how it interacted with his rotting body. The excessive eating made his health problems worse, which made him eat more to try to feel better, creating a vicious cycle that accelerated his physical decay. As his legs became more infected and painful, he would eat more to distract himself from the pain. As his mobility decreased, he ate more out of boredom and frustration. By his final years, Henry's eating habits had become so extreme that his servants were genuinely concerned he might eat himself to death during a single meal. There are accounts of Henry consuming so much food so quickly that he would become violently ill, vomiting up partially digested meals before immediately demanding more food. His stomach had apparently stretched to accommodate such enormous quantities that normal portions left him feeling empty and unsatisfied. The psychological aspects of Henry's eating were perhaps the most disturbing of all. Food had become his primary source of pleasure and control in a life where his body was betraying him and his mind was deteriorating. When everything else was falling apart, he could still command the preparation of elaborate feasts and force people to watch him consume them. Eating became a way for Henry to assert his power and demonstrate his royal status, even as his physical appearance made him look more like a monster than a king. The waste generated by Henry's eating habits was staggering. Leftover food from royal meals could have fed hundreds of people, but it was often thrown away or given to dogs rather than distributed to the poor. The king's gluttony wasn't just personally destructive, it was a symbol of the incredible inequality and waste that characterized his reign. Even Henry's physicians were afraid to tell him that his eating habits were killing him, because criticizing the king's lifestyle could be considered treason. They were forced to watch their patient destroy himself with food while being unable to provide the basic medical advice that might have saved his life. The very power that allowed Henry to eat whatever he wanted in whatever quantities he desired also ensured that no one could tell him he needed to stop. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just a personal quirk, it was the infectious disease that spread throughout his entire kingdom, turning England into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators envious. By his final years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was plotting against him that he transformed royal life into a psychological horror show where nobody knew who they could trust, and saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you executed. Let's start with Henry's sleeping arrangements, which reveal the depth of his mental illness. The king slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and kept multiple daggers under his pillow, but that was just the beginning of his nighttime security theater. Henry also had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Think about the psychological state required to be so terrified of assassination that you can't even close your eyes without armed witnesses. But even having guards in his bedroom wasn't enough for Henry's paranoid mind. He also required that his guards be rotated every few hours because he was convinced that spending too much time alone with him would give them opportunities to plan his murder. The guards watching Henry sleep were themselves watched by other guards, creating layers of surveillance that turned the royal bedchamber into something resembling a high-security prison. The palace itself became a fortress of paranoia under Henry's direction. He ordered the construction of secret passages throughout every building he lived in, not for romantic rendezvous or convenient travel, but so he could escape if assassins came for him. These passages were elaborate networks of hidden corridors and escape routes that allowed Henry to move through his own palaces without being seen by his own staff. Henry had peepholes installed in walls so he could spy on his own courtiers, and listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private conversations. The technology was primitive by modern standards, but the psychological impact was devastating. People never knew when the king might be watching or listening, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and fear. But here's where Henry's paranoia reached truly insane levels. He created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web of surveillance where nobody knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological nightmare where everyone was potentially reporting on everyone else, and the wrong word to the wrong person could result in accusations of treason. The most disturbing aspect of Henry's surveillance network was how it turned people against their own families. Children were encouraged to report on their parents, spouses were rewarded for betraying each other, and servants were given incentives to inform on their masters. Henry had successfully created a society where personal relationships were secondary to loyalty to the crown, and where trust was literally dangerous. Henry's food paranoia reached levels that bordered on the absurd. Not only did he have multiple food tasters, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens with guards watching every step of the cooking process. Every ingredient had to be tested by different people, and the entire preparation process was monitored by security personnel who were themselves monitored by other security personnel. The paranoid security measures around Henry's food were so extensive that preparing a simple meal became a military operation. The salt had to be tested, the water had to be verified as safe, even the plates and utensils had to be examined for poison. The kitchen staff lived in constant fear that some contamination or mistake in the food would be blamed on them as an assassination attempt, leading to their execution. But Henry's paranoia wasn't limited to adults. He actually suspected his own children of plotting against him. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he was convinced they were planning to overthrow him. These were children, and he treated them like enemy agents in their own home. The psychological impact on Mary and Elizabeth of growing up knowing their father considered them potential threats was devastating and influenced their entire lives. The most grotesque aspect of Henry's paranoia was how it affected his relationships with his wives. Each marriage became an exercise in psychological warfare where Henry would test his wife's loyalty through elaborate schemes and traps. He would have servants report fake conversations to see how his wife would react, or he would pretend to be ill to see if she would show appropriate concern or if she might be hoping for his death. Henry's paranoid testing of his wives often involved having them followed by spies who would report on their every conversation and activity. The women were essentially prisoners in their own marriages, unable to have private conversations or personal relationships without wondering if everything they said was being reported back to their increasingly unstable husband. The paranoia became so extreme that Henry started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He would have someone killed because he dreamed they betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The Tower of London was constantly filled with people whose only crime was existing near Henry while he was in one of his paranoid episodes. One of the most disturbing examples of Henry's preemptive executions involved the Marquess of Exeter, who was executed primarily because Henry had a dream that the man was plotting against him. The Marquess had shown nothing but loyalty to Henry throughout his life, but the king's paranoid interpretation of a dream was enough to justify his death. This set a precedent that made everyone around Henry live in constant terror, because loyalty and innocence were no protection against the king's paranoid fantasies. Henry's paranoia was so contagious that it infected his entire court and eventually spread throughout England. Nobles started spying on each other for imaginary rewards, servants betrayed their masters to protect themselves from accusations, and everyone lived in constant fear that they would be the next victim of the king's delusional suspicions. The psychological impact of living under Henry's paranoid surveillance state was devastating for everyone involved. People couldn't trust their friends, their family members, or even their own servants. Every conversation had to be carefully monitored for anything that could be interpreted as criticism of the king, and every relationship had to be evaluated for its potential to create suspicion. The most tragic aspect of Henry's paranoia was how it destroyed genuine loyalty and created the very disloyalty he was trying to prevent. People who had been genuinely devoted to Henry became resentful and fearful, while those who might have been plotting against him learned to be more careful and deceptive. The surveillance state didn't make Henry safer, it made him more isolated and ultimately more vulnerable. By the end of his reign, Henry was essentially a prisoner of his own paranoia. He couldn't trust anyone, couldn't form genuine relationships, and couldn't even enjoy the power he had fought so hard to maintain. The man who had started his reign as a popular and charismatic king had become an isolated, terrified, and increasingly unstable dictator who saw enemies everywhere and could find comfort nowhere. The most ironic aspect of Henry's elaborate security measures is that they probably made him less safe rather than more safe. The constant surveillance and testing created an atmosphere of resentment and fear that motivated genuine plots against him, while the paranoid reactions to imaginary threats distracted attention from real dangers. Henry's paranoia had become a self-fulfilling prophecy that created the very environment of disloyalty and threat that he was trying to prevent. You'd think that death would put an end to Henry VIII's capacity for causing absolute chaos and horror, but you'd be wrong. This man was so committed to being a disaster that even his corpse managed to traumatize everyone who came into contact with it, creating a final spectacle of grotesque horror that perfectly summarized his entire reign. Let's start with Henry's final weeks of life, which were like something out of a medieval horror story. The king had become so massive that he couldn't support his own weight, requiring teams of servants to carry him everywhere using specially designed chairs with pulleys and wheels. But the most disturbing part wasn't his immobility, it was the fact that pieces of his rotting body were literally falling off as they moved him. Henry's leg wounds had become so severely infected that chunks of decomposing flesh would drop from his body as he was transported from room to room. Palace servants were assigned to follow behind his mobile chair with cloths and buckets, cleaning up the pieces of rotting king that fell along the way. Imagine having a job description that included royal flesh cleanup duty and trying to maintain your sanity while performing those duties day after day. The smell emanating from Henry's body had become so overwhelming that even his physicians, who were used to medieval medical horrors, had to leave his presence to vomit. The stench was reportedly detectable from several rooms away, and servants would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when forced to attend to him. Some historical accounts describe the smell as being worse than the open sewers of London, which is saying something considering the sanitary conditions of 16th century England. Henry's death scene was like something from a supernatural horror movie. His body had swollen to such grotesque proportions that his skin was stretched tight and shiny, giving him an appearance that witnesses described as barely human. The combination of extreme obesity, massive infections, and fluid retention had transformed the king into something that looked more like a monster than a man. But the psychological horror of Henry's final days went beyond his physical appearance. The man who had spent his entire reign terrorizing others was now completely helpless and dependent on the mercy of people he had spent decades abusing. Servants who had lived in fear of Henry's violent outbursts now had to provide the most intimate care for a man whose body was falling apart in the most disgusting ways possible. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed Henry's final days. The king, who had claimed divine right to rule and insisted that God had chosen him for greatness, couldn't even control his own bodily functions. Royal attendants had to carry portable toilets wherever Henry went because he could barely make it from room to room without having accidents. The man who had executed people for showing him insufficient respect was literally falling apart in the most undignified ways imaginable. When Henry finally died on January 28, 1547, nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm that he was dead. The smell and appearance of his corpse were so horrific that even his personal physicians were reluctant to approach the body. It took several hours before anyone was willing to verify that the king had actually died, because examining his body closely enough to confirm death was considered an almost unbearable ordeal. But the real horror show was just beginning. Henry's body was so bloated with gases from internal decomposition that his coffin had to be specially reinforced to contain the pressure. They wrapped his corpse in lead sheets and sealed it in multiple wooden boxes, thinking that would contain the grotesque reality of what the king's body had become. They were catastrophically wrong. The funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle turned into one of the most disturbing spectacles in English royal history. Somewhere along the journey, the gases from Henry's decomposing body built up so much pressure that his coffin literally exploded. The lead lining burst open, and rotting royal remains splattered all over the inside of the funeral hearse. The smell when the coffin burst was so horrific that the entire funeral procession had to stop while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags. Imagine being tasked with scooping up pieces of your former king from the inside of a hearse while trying not to vomit from the stench. The pageantry and dignity of a royal funeral had been transformed into a grotesque cleanup operation that traumatized everyone involved. But here's a detail that will absolutely haunt your nightmares. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who had claimed to rule by divine right, who had insisted that he was God's chosen representative on earth, ended up as literal dog food scattered on a country highway. The symbolism couldn't have been more perfect if it had been planned. Even Henry's burial became a disaster that seemed to mock everything he had stood for during his life. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin, but the ground kept collapsing because the soil couldn't support the weight of all that lead and rotting flesh. It took multiple attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. The construction of Henry's tomb was delayed for years because nobody wanted to work on a project that required handling the king's remains or working near his burial site. The smell from his grave was reportedly detectable for months after his burial, leading to rumors that his body was continuing to decompose in ways that defied natural processes. For years after Henry's death, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from his tomb. Some claimed it was his ghost seeking revenge for his sins, but historians think it was probably just more gases escaping from his continuously decomposing remains. The idea that Henry's body was so corrupt that it couldn't even decompose normally became a popular explanation for the ongoing disturbances around his burial site. The psychological impact of Henry's death and burial on those who witnessed it was profound and lasting. Several of the servants who handled his body during his final illness and after his death reportedly died within weeks, possibly from infections they caught from contact with his rotting corpse. The trauma of dealing with Henry's physical decay combined with the stress of serving such a violent and unpredictable master seems to have literally killed some of his attendants. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henry's death was how it perfectly encapsulated his entire reign. Just as he had caused chaos, horror, and trauma during his life, his death continued to traumatize and disgust everyone who came into contact with him. Even in death, Henry VIII managed to be a source of fear, revulsion, and psychological damage for those around him. The explosion of Henry's coffin became a symbol that perfectly captured the corruption and excess of his reign. The man who had lived without limits or restraints, who had consumed everything he wanted and destroyed anyone who opposed him, had literally become too corrupt for his own coffin to contain. His body had become so bloated with the excesses of his life that death itself couldn't bring him under control. The final irony of Henry VIII's death is that it stripped away all the pretense and ceremony that had surrounded his life, revealing the fundamental reality of what he had become. Without the crown, the titles, the palaces, and the power, Henry was revealed to be exactly what his actions had suggested all along, a rotting, corrupt, and fundamentally disgusting specimen of humanity, whose very presence was toxic to those around him. The fact that dogs were willing to consume Henry's remains when humans couldn't bear to be near them says everything you need to know about what this man had become by the end of his life. The king who had demanded worship and absolute obedience had become something so revolting that only animals would willingly interact with his physical remains. The death of Henry VIII should have brought relief to England, but the psychological and political damage he had inflicted during his 38-year reign continued to traumatize the kingdom long after his rotting corpse was finally sealed away in its reinforced tomb. We're talking about generational trauma that affected not just the immediate survivors of his reign, but their children and grandchildren as well. Henry's surviving daughter Mary had been so psychologically damaged by watching her father's treatment of her mother Catherine of Aragon that she spent her own reign trying to undo everything Henry had done, earning herself the nickname Bloody Mary for her violent persecution of Protestants. The psychological scars from growing up under Henry's paranoid surveillance, watching her mother be systematically destroyed, and living in constant fear that she too might be executed for displeasing her father, turned Mary into another monster who ruled through terror and violence. Elizabeth, Henry's other surviving daughter, was equally traumatized but channeled her damage differently. Having watched her father execute her mother Anne Boleyn when Elizabeth was just 2 years old, and then spending her childhood never knowing if she would be declared legitimate or bastard depending on Henry's mood, Elizabeth developed her own paranoid tendencies and trust issues that defined her entire reign. She never married, possibly because she had witnessed firsthand what happened to women who became too close to absolute power. The English nobility had been so decimated by Henry's paranoid executions that entire bloodlines were wiped out, creating a power vacuum that led to decades of political instability. Families that had served the crown loyally for generations were destroyed because Henry suspected them of disloyalty, while opportunistic newcomers rose to power by betraying their betters to gain royal favor. The traditional structures of English aristocracy were permanently damaged by Henry's reign of terror. The religious chaos Henry created by breaking with Rome didn't end with his death. It continued to tear England apart for generations. His decision to make himself head of the English Church wasn't based on genuine religious conviction, but on his desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon, yet this selfish decision led to centuries of religious warfare, persecution, and civil conflict that cost thousands of lives. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Henry's reign established dangerous precedents about royal power that influenced English monarchs for centuries. The idea that a king could simply change laws, execute nobles, and remake entire institutions to suit his personal desires became part of the royal playbook. Future monarchs looked to Henry as an example of what absolute power could accomplish, rather than as a cautionary tale about what happens when power corrupts completely. The financial damage from Henry's excessive lifestyle and constant wars nearly bankrupted England. His gluttonous consumption, expensive palaces, and military campaigns had drained the royal treasury and left the kingdom in debt that took decades to recover from. The man who claimed to be England's greatest king had actually brought the country to the brink of economic collapse. But perhaps the most lasting damage Henry inflicted was psychological. He had transformed England from a relatively stable medieval kingdom into a surveillance state where nobody could trust anyone, where personal relationships were subordinated to political survival, and where saying the wrong thing could get you executed. The paranoid atmosphere he created lingered long after his death, influencing how English people related to authority and to each other. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII, stripped of all the romantic nonsense and historical whitewashing that has somehow turned one of history's most disgusting monsters into a figure of fascination rather than revulsion. This wasn't a charismatic king who made some mistakes or a tragic figure who was corrupted by power. This was a man who was fundamentally broken, physically revolting, and psychologically twisted in ways that traumatized everyone who came into contact with him. The most disturbing part of Henry VIII's story isn't just what he did, but how history has tried to rehabilitate his image. We've turned a man whose own body was literally rotting while he was alive, who psychologically tortured his wives before executing them, and whose paranoia turned an entire kingdom into a surveillance state, into the subject of romantic movies and television shows. It's as if we've collectively decided to forget the horrific reality of what this man actually was. Henry VIII represents the absolute worst of what human beings can become when given unlimited power and no consequences for their actions. His story isn't entertainment, it's a warning about what happens when societies allow individuals to accumulate too much power and when we fail to hold our leaders accountable for their behavior. The next time you see Henry VIII portrayed as some kind of larger-than-life romantic figure, remember the servants who had to clean up pieces of his rotting flesh, the wives who lived in terror of his violent mood swings, and the thousands of people who died because this monster couldn't control his paranoid fantasies. Remember that his own coffin couldn't contain the corruption of his body, just as his kingdom couldn't contain the corruption of his soul. This is what unchecked power looks like. This is what happens when we allow monsters to wear crowns. And this is why we must never forget the true horrifying story of Henry VIII, not the myth but the reality of England's most disgusting king.